I'm going to try to report it as little drama as possible, because it seems like people sometimes get carried away with telling stories like this, and I want to avoid that if I can. This happened a long time ago, and not even in America. But I was discussing it for the first time the other day, and suddenly realized that it actually involves three main factors involved in many of the missing 411 cases: a pond, a dog behaving very strangely, and lots of granite. So I was a teenager at the time, and due to unusual circumstances, my dad woke me up in the middle of the night to walk the dog with him and talk. It was around 2 a.m. It was a full moon and a very bright night with excellent visibility. The sky was clear, and we were walking on a granite hill, an extinct volcano that has a valley in the middle with a small lake in it. We skirted the lake before climbing the edge of the valley to the ridge with the dog on a leash. As we began to approach the top of the slope, the dog stopped and flatly refused to go any further in the direction we were walking. I also mean that he was literally dead weight on a leash, and we would have to literally drag him with our bodies to move another inch forward. We realized that he had caught his tail between his legs, was visibly shaking and crouched down, making himself as small as possible. He was also completely fixated on something in front of us that we didn't actually notice or pay attention to beforehand. It appeared to be a straight black line coming vertically out of the ground. I remember thinking at first that it was a plastic tube that used to protect vulnerable saplings from deer, because when we first spotted it, there was no sign of it except for a black vertical stripe. But as we watched the straight black streak unfold into a crude humanoid form, I think it was about 8 feet tall. Unfolded is the best term I can come up with to describe the process. But if you've ever seen a butterfly emerge from some ball, it was something like. Although the figure was completely black, it had no visible features or contrast to any degree, despite the bright moonlight, and the color black didn't show how dark the thing really was. It was what I imagined a black hole might look like. And while the shape itself wasn't transparent or insubstantial in any way, the outlines were a bit fuzzy or blurry, almost like something vibrating very quickly or a high-spin washing machine or something. Also, he didn't have human proportions. It was almost like a child's drawing of a stick man, but with disproportionately long arms and legs. If you imagine something like a stick insect made of vantablack material in a crude human form, then you're pretty close to the mark. The head was unusually small, though I remember the top of the head being somewhat flat, although my father does not. In all other respects, our memories of the event are identical, which tells me I'm not crazy. It all happened in maybe less than a minute, and then it turned around and came back at us. I'm not going to give it a melodramatic description, and words really don't do it justice, but even though it lacked any features that could be defined as eyes or a face, you could feel the thing's attention towards you. Also, instantly, every hair on my body stood up and I got goosebumps. I turned to my father and said, "Dad, what is this?" He's one of the most skeptical and level-headed people I know, so it really scared me that his answer was as simple as, "I don't know, but we need to get out of here right now." And to hear the genuine fear in my father's voice at such a young...
I remember his arms swinging in long arcs as he moved. Mind you, he didn't show any signs of aggression at all. He just followed, keeping the same distance from us all the time. He was absolutely silent when he followed us. There was no sound, which was very strange. During this chase, we were in a state of high adrenaline, and the atmosphere was extremely tense, but we exchanged very few words, other than whispers like, "Is everything still following us, and don't look at it?" It didn't even occur to us to run, which seems unusual in retrospect. None of us even thought it was just another person on a walk. At this point, I think we both had an almost literally overwhelming sense of the wrongness of the situation. And after about 5 minutes, I stopped. I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was something along the lines of, "This is complete madness. What is happening?" What is this thing? And when we stopped, it stopped. And again he simply turned to face us. However, due to the complete lack of features, it could also be turned straight away from us. But as I said, there was a certain physical sensation of having the awareness of the thing focused on you. We stood in complete silence. The dog continued to distract us. It stood still for a minute or two, and then, as we watched, it turned, sank into the hard ground, and simply disappeared. Immediately there was a feeling that some charge in the air dissipated, and we began to move back to the car. When we got back, we were still high on adrenaline, obviously, and woke everyone up to tell them what we had seen. And this is the story. I really can't add anything else that isn't just a dramatic flourish to the story. The dog's behavior was very unusual for him. If we were to encounter another human under the same circumstances, I have no doubt that he would bark and pull on his leash to get closer to them instead of running away like that. Partly because he was on a leash as well, but also because he was a rescuer and very prone to chasing animals and disappearing for about 20 minutes. Needless to say, we were both deeply shaken, as neither of us could think of a plausible explanation for what we had experienced. Sometimes over the years, people have suggested that it was a broken ghost where our own shadows were cast by the moon on a foggy slope or a low cloud. But I just can't accept that explanation. There was simply no fog or cloud, and visibility was excellent thanks to the clear air and bright moonlight. And frankly, I, like my father, have no theories about what we saw. Although I still consider myself a skeptical person, this has definitely killed my ability to dismiss other people's stories about weird and wild theories, even those that seem absurd at first glance. It's hard for me to laugh in someone's face when they say they think Bigfoot is real, but comes from another dimension, for example, or that something otherworldly is leading people into the desert. Although obviously I have no reason to believe that it was the snowman and that the incident happened in Scotland. Although many years after it happened, and many years ago, I found a thread on a bushcraft forum where people were discussing scary experiences in the wild. To my surprise, there was indeed a hunter who reported seeing the same thing while crossing a clearing in the woods from a hunting hide during a full moon in America. I don't have the link because it was a long time ago, but they reported identical details. The small head, the long arms that moved in hanging arcs as they walked, the slow, deliberate step, the complete blackness and lack of features, and even the vague outlines that they described exactly as if they vibrated. Obviously, you can make of it what you want. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything, and I'm not holding any particular theory about what we saw. I just thought it was worth sharing here.
But before I end, I want to briefly touch on the two most obvious explanations for what we've been through and why I've had a hard time accepting them. But first, because it has to do with one of them, let me mention that there are at least a few caves on this hill, and that they used to be associated with terrible things, although I didn't know it at the time. In 1836, a group of schoolchildren found a small entrance to a previously unknown cave on the hill next to which it happened. They contained 17 miniature coffins containing what we would today describe as voodoo dolls, some of which are still on display in the National Museum of Scotland today. But in any case, now about rational explanations. So the first is that we were hallucinating. The problem is that the dog's strange behavior was caused by something unrelated, but in a familiar environment. In the darkness, we have fallen into some kind of adrenaline when our mind projects a perceived threat onto an unexpected object. Maybe one of those tubes used to protect the trees I mentioned earlier. And were we both hallucinating the same thing? I don't know, it's hard for me to accept because of the specific details we both remembered afterwards. The wrong hands, the small head, the vibrating outline, the slow, deliberate step, the waving of the arms, the strong feeling when his attention was fixed on us, and all this despite the fact that we did not speak of what we saw at the time, and also that the dog was very clearly focused on the same thing as us. And the absolutely horrible. Second, it was exactly what it appeared to be. A very unusually tall, black-skinned, emaciated man who vibrated. In that case, they would have crawled out of the hole in the ground, remembered the cave, and perhaps shivered in the cold. This is Scotland, after all. They then followed us in silence before descending underground through another hole. You know what? I can almost take it. And that because of the adrenaline. Our brain perceives it as more dramatically weird than it actually was. The problem with this theory is that it would still be pretty weird, right? But it really brings us back to the tangible world of things, which I guess actually exist because, although Scotland is approximately 98% white, there are still thousands of black-skinned Scots. And this, maybe some of them are very high, I guess. I guess the only thing worth adding to this is that this event seemed to flip some kind of switch in my head that made me no longer afraid of the dark in any way. You'd think things would have gone the other way and I don't come across as a vampire or some possessed creature of the night or anything. But at the time, I was working in a bakery and walking to work along a river in a deep valley in the middle of the night. Sometimes it was so dark that you had to feel the way ahead with your hands. And I'm not ashamed to admit that I was a little scared at times, especially when a fox suddenly screamed right next to you. But after this event, just never. I can walk through the deepest, darkest forest, an abandoned building or mine in total darkness, without feeling even the slightest bit of fear after the incident. And I really don't know why, but it is to the extent that people have commented on it. I don't know how you can do such things. Not being afraid of the dark is hardly a superpower, but it's always been a much less scary experience for me after that encounter. And I really can't rationalize why, because it seems like it would make a lot more sense if it instilled a fear of the dark, not deleted this. Anyway, that's all I have to say, and in the unlikely event that you've seen the same thing, please let me know because I really want to try to figure it out. If anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer, but I don't think I've missed anything major, so maybe that's it. Anyway, thanks for listening, and we hope it doesn't happen again. This happened back in 2019, I believe around November 2nd.
Also, I can assure you that this is true, although I'm not sure if it was just a coincidence or what it was. So in 2019, I was very depressed all year. Not that it was really bad, but let's just say that I stopped wearing my seatbelt, smoked twice as many cigarettes as usual, and for the most part didn't take care of my well-being. Because of that, and because of my mental deterioration, I did a lot of stupid, supernatural things. I've always known that you can't talk to the dead, knowing that if you talk to one spirit, the others can hear you too. I've always been very superstitious and believe in the paranormal, the supernatural 100%. But anyway, I live near this huge cemetery and drive past it every day since it's right across the street from my neighborhood. Because of my superstition and belief that the dead can do things we humans can't, every day I would scream out the window as I passed the cemetery, asking one of the spirits to get into a car accident. This habit I think started on November 2nd, so I did it every day when I drove by the cemetery. Here, on November 6th, I was driving to work around 4:30 in the morning. I walked the same road every day, and when I hit a red light, I came out of nowhere. I kid you not, it literally came out of nowhere. I heard a loud horn behind me, and one of those big white RGs ran into me from behind. Since I was at a red light, it practically pushed my car forward into the middle of the intersection, and again out of nowhere, I got hit by some random old dude in a van with his wife. I was driving in 05 Nissan Sentra at the time, and it was completely wrecked, literally wrecked, and I didn't have a single scratch on it. My knees were pretty beat up. I have no idea how it happened, but that was pretty much it. It also happened literally on the main road coming out of my neighborhood, about a mile away from the cemetery. Never, and I mean never, are there cars this early in the morning. There may be one from time to time, but even that is rare in most cases. Also, while I was talking to the old man, they lived in the city literally 40 minutes away and were driving to the park. This whole story is just so weird and honestly makes me cringe, but yes, I was in an extremely bad financial position, so I was without a car for quite some time. I was driving near a cemetery, praying I would get into an accident. What I meant was that I wanted it to be over. So I think the spirit that heard me, or whoever wanted to mess with me or something, take that as you will. Maybe it was a very strange coincidence, but if not, always remember to be careful what you wish for. So my mom is a paramedic, has been in the NHS for about 30 plus years, a well-known employee. And true to its reputation, it is known for its share of ghost stories about an old mortuary in northwest England, withheld for privacy reasons, which is now demolished along with the rest of the hospital and has a residential complex. Her biggest surprise, however, has to be when they dropped off an expired patient. So this happened back in the 90s, when the hospital was still mostly in use. They were in the morgue, transferring an expired patient, as I said. The following information is very important to the story, but the ER was mostly a concrete garage with one dim light inside and was directly across from a shopping center or morgue. Ambulance also needed a key to lock all the doors, so the mom and her coworker walked out of the morgue, chatting as usual, when her coworker stopped and stared into the emergency room, because there, in the far corner behind the dim light, just stood a dark figure. Another important piece of information. It was at night. However, they brushed him off as an object in the back of the bay after he hadn't moved for a while, and the light also made it difficult to see him, so like I said, they just brushed him off. They made their way to the ambulance without thinking anything of it, and got in, using the key to unlock it. Mom put the key in the ignition but didn't start the engine because they needed to fill out the rest of the paperwork. And while they were filling out the paperwork, the ambulance door suddenly closed. All of them, outside. They froze, as if looking at each other, then looked up in front of them. When they looked up, both of their eyes locked on the morgue door they opened, and then another figure silently stepped out of it and went straight to the ambulance. According to my mom, they must have walled it up, starting to freak out as the thing got closer. They were unable to get out of the ambulance, as it was locked from the outside. Their only choice was to leave, and when they did, the figure simply vanished into thin air, and the morgue door was still wide open. Now I know some of you may be saying they couldn't just go back to their station. Well, that hospital was their emergency room. They also refused to return until it was daylight outside. My mom remembers how they came back in the morning, and her colleagues were describing her white sheet. They were the same after my mom told them the story. After that, they all refused to park there and even avoided the morgue whenever possible. But whoever lives in that place now, I feel very sorry for him. She has a lot of ghost stories from that place, and hell, some of them are even pretty funny. They are really mixed up with some dark sarcasm from my mom. I'll be sure to share some of them if you guys don't want me to. But generally, ghosts never bothered my mother, even up to that point because she had been through so much. But this one, as she always said, just never satisfied her. It was in 2015 when I was 16 years old. By the way, I am also a man. It was the summer when both of my parents went to visit relatives out of town and were gone for 3 days. I was the only child left in this house, and my grandmother visited me every day to make me lunch and whatnot. I didn't actually ask her to do it because, well, I could cook. But I mean, who can stop old Nan, right? But of course there were no nights left. And that was when I pretty much went wild. Watch movies, play games, watch YouTube, as much as I wanted. I mean, everything you can imagine a 16-year-old doing when their parents aren't home. The other night I was just watching a movie and I ran out of chips. I paused the movie and went down to the kitchen to get some more. Suddenly I hear a window smash and a door open. The kitchen was separated from the living room and the door was opened. I quickly grabbed the knife and slowly examined the head. And there he was, a tall guy about 2 meters tall, wearing a baseball cap, some kind of old jacket, probably leather. It was torn on the right sleeve, but my phone was in the upstairs room. The stairs were directly to the right of the kitchen door, so in my stupid mind, I thought I could sneak past it and lock myself. Must say, rummaging very loudly on the shelf next to the door. So I somehow made it to the stairs, and he turned around at the last second, and realized I was there. Out of fear, I must have just screamed and threw the knife at him, and I missed, but there was a knife sticking out of the wall next to his head.
I guess he was scared of me too, my wild screams and throwing of the knife, so he just ran before I could grab the other knife. Yes, I ran back to get another one. Adrenaline is a hell of a thing, right? And when I saw that he was gone, I ran to my room and called the police. They arrived quickly and simply took fingerprints and any DNA samples they could find. The next morning I called my parents and they came back around noon. I don't know why, but I also kept a knife in the wall by the door. But the first question they asked was, why the knife in the wall? We ended up changing the front door to a really heavy one, and they arrested the guy that same week.
And one of the cops told me that the guy supposedly thought I was going to kill him and was trying to call the police on an attempted murder or something. Guess what, right? So I guess the moral of the story is to hide when someone is robbing your house, or at least learn to act like a maniac like me. About 5 or 6 months ago, my partner and I were struggling to find a landlord to rent to us. But with the imminent arrival of our daughter approaching, we became absolutely desperate for a place to move. Eventually, we found a relatively inexpensive 2-bedroom apartment, and the owner was happy to let it to us. About a week before we moved all our things into the apartment and unpacked, I had my daughter, and we started filling the walls with artwork and placing decor amongst the various tabletops and shelves and everything else, and my partner was very passionate about arranging and decorating everything to feel at home. After about a month of living in this apartment, I started to feel a little out of sorts as the evening drew on. At first, I just shrugged off being a new parent, thinking I was just protecting my new daughter and my partner. After about 3.5 months of living in the apartment, apart from the periodic alarm at night, everything became normal and safe. But one night I was laying on the couch around 2 a.m. The way the unit is built also allows me to see straight down the kitchen hallway to the bathroom and the master bedroom door as I lay on the couch. And as I lay there, I began to see some sort of swift, dark apparition move from the bedroom door to the hall closets. Leo. It started looking like something was running back and forth from where my partner and baby were sleeping to the unit next to us. Obviously, the sight made me feel a little anxious, so I went to my bedroom with my sleeping family and went to bed. The following week, my partner and I were sitting on the sofa in the afternoon. My partner was breastfeeding his daughter, often looking down at the TV while I was playing video games, or just looking down at her phone and whatnot. She was standing the same way I was when I saw the shadows a week ago, and she was standing perpendicular to the TV. And she said, "Baby," with a look of surprise on her face. I just saw the tip of the white dress go into the bathroom. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end at those words, and this time I began to feel fear. She saw the frightened look on my face, and I turned to ask her if she was sure. "Yes, don't be afraid. If it was here to hurt us, I would probably feel the fear too. Just a light stain," I think she told me. My partner and I are First Nations, and because of this, the cultural teachings and beliefs we both grew up with, we are both very aware of the existence of spirits and ghosts, and how best to deal with them. However, my partner has more paranormal and spiritual experiences than I do. Smudging is simply burning sage, and we have used it whenever we have experienced any of these phenomena, as we believe it is a spiritual medicine that provides protection and cleansing from any negative energy or entity. But anyway, around the 4th month of living in this apartment, my partner and I started experiencing things moving outside of our field of vision and hearing strange noises. The first time it happened was when we heard the crunching of shoes and something in a high heel thrown around the corner by the front door. It happened again late at night, probably around midnight, and I immediately thought that someone had entered our apartment. So I opened my pocket knife and quickly ran around the corner, but when I did, there was nothing but a high heel in the middle of the doorway, which had a cry, was finally placed on the shoe rack with all the others. My partner and I soiled ourselves and went back to bed because we weren't interested in going any further that night. But we clearly remember that after that we were watched every night and often felt a presence around us. My partner and I approached family members asking what we should do, and they suggested we treat the subject occupying the house. In our culture, serving alcoholic beverages is part of our duties, and when they make their presence known in this way, it usually means it's time to serve them again. I cooked the food, My partner and I prayed over it, put it in some kind of small wooden plate, and then left it in the apartment. From the beginning of the 4th month until the middle of it, we began to experience paranormal events almost daily. A week ago, my partner heard our rocking chair hit the wall in the living room, and 2 days ago, she heard the cardboard from my daughter's new crib rustle in a way that it couldn't have done on its own. Although we were both long overdue for a treat, it didn't seem to mitigate the events we experienced in our apartment. The feeling of anxiety at night has also developed into a kind of moderate anxiety. Several times my daughter, who was 4.5 months old, woke up suddenly screaming bloody murder. Sometimes we also left her to play with a toy on the swing while we washed the dishes in the hallway. And on several occasions she would start screaming, like several times when she woke up. It is also within our belief that since babies are new to this physical world, their perception is still closely intertwined with the spiritual world. So we became concerned with the idea that she could see this thing occupying our apartment. Last night around 3 a.m., we were all sleeping in the bedrooms at the end of the hall, and in the next room my laptop started playing YouTube videos at full volume. It was loud enough to wake us both up, and I know I watched a YouTube video before I closed my laptop and went to sleep, but I can never remember a moment when my laptop, or any laptop for that matter, started playing any multimedia in closed state. I didn't even have the volume on full blast, so it was really amazing. And all of this is by far the most paranormal activity I have ever experienced in my entire life, and even for my partner, I feel like it's getting tiring and scary. I recognize that on the one hand, we feel that due to the stress and isolation of this pandemic, perhaps our negative emotions and energy attract entities of evil intent. On the other hand, we believe that perhaps the other occupants of the building also bring these entities here. However, any speculation as to why this might be happening is just speculation, and we'll probably never know exactly why it's going down. I'm not really sure what to do at this point because, well, we can't move and don't understand why all this stuff is still here or what's really going on. But if any of you have any ideas on what we could do next, then I'm all ears. Once, when I was 6 or 7 years old, I was playing with my cousin, who was 12 years old at the time. It was getting late, and we decided to go one last street and then stop. The first house was done, and there were only 4 still standing and handing out candy. We split up to cover more houses quickly, and I went up the road and got candy from the 2 houses my cousin had assigned me to, and I'm going back to meet her. I go to where our meeting was, but she is not there. So I just decided to go to the 2 houses she went to. I get to the first one, and I knock, and my handsome 30-year-old man answers and asks me if I want to come in to get my candy, and I'm about to say yes, when my cousin howls like a bat out of hell. And exiting that room, that was just around the corner from that front door, she pushes the guy against the wall, grabs me, and runs out of the house as fast as she can. I'm yelling because I dropped the bag of candy and she's crying a little. Our house was not far from this point, and when we got home she was in complete hysterics, babbling to my mom and her sister about what had happened. I didn't understand it at the time, but a couple of years later my mom explained that my cousin refused to come over to get candy, and he hit her on the head and dragged her into the house semi-conscious. When I got to the door, she heard my voice and regained her senses enough to get up and kick me out. Apparently my mom called the police, and when they searched the man's house, they found emails on his computer that were linked to a human trafficking ring. To this day, it chills me to the bone to think of what would have happened if I had just waited for her to come instead of going to the house of someone like me. His cousin is actually in therapy for PTSD after that incident, and that was the last time she went out for a treat. Hello friends, this is B-Buster, and I'd like to thank HelloFresh for sponsoring this episode. So with HelloFresh, you get fresh, pre-measured ingredients and mouth-watering seasonal recipes delivered right to your door. Skip trips to the grocery store and count on HelloFresh to make cooking easy, fun, and affordable. And that's why it's the #1 meal kit in America. HelloFresh takes the stress out of meal planning and trips to the grocery store, so you can enjoy cooking and have dinner on the table in about 30 minutes or less. And their fresh ingredients are sourced directly from the growers and delivered from the farm to your front door in less than a week. It's free to contact, of course. HelloFresh is also 28% cheaper than shopping at your local grocery store, and 72% cheaper than eating out without compromising on quality. But one particular recipe that I also enjoyed was the garlic oregano halloumi tacos with lemon aioli and caramelized onions. I know, it seems like a bit of an odd combo, but man, they were delicious. So enjoy America's #1 meal kit today and go to hellofresh.com/bescared12 and use code bescared12 to get 12 free meals including free shipping. So I was at a job where I had to drive side to side and do small shelf upgrades at every CVS pharmacy in California. I'm about a month into my contract and have to drive over 100 miles through the redwoods to my next location. As I was driving, I noticed that I could smell something. A slight smell. If I even smell it, the client will be 100 times worse. That means I'll have to figure out how to shower and change before arriving at my next location. I'm about 40 miles deep on this isolated stretch of highway through the redwoods when I see the camp sign at the next exit. I make a turn to see if they have showers. I pull into this really small camp, which consisted of about 15 sites tied together in a circle. Terrible camp, but it's deserted and they have showers. Perfect. I grab a towel and a change of clothes and head to the bath building. As I get closer, I hear water running and I walk up to the building and someone is taking a shower in one of the cubicles. It's really amazing. I mean, the camp is empty. No cars, no tents. It's the middle of winter, and we're miles and miles away from civilization, so who in the world could be there? It has to be a pot farmer, right? Maybe a homeless dude? Does Sequoia Labs have meth? I'm not really scared by it, but my instincts tell me it's very strange. I decide to go ahead and use one of the showers a few cubicles away from him. I am comforted by the fact that the door is thick metal with a large, strong lock on the bolt. The shower works for a quarter. Nice California. I take off my clothes and slide the quarters into the slot, and the water opens immediately. A second later, I hear whoever this person is just yelling weird noises and profanity, and I must have stolen his hot water or something. I feel terrible, but I can't stop it now. Water flows instantly when the quarters enter. I can't do anything. I'm treading water so restlessly, wondering what's going on in the other guy's head. I don't have to wait long to find out. About a minute later, I'm taking a shower when I hear a loud bang, crashes against my metal shower door, then screams, and then more banging. But this dude is trying to kick my door down at that moment. I was petrified. I get out of the shower and stand by the door, wet, naked, fists up in case he walks in. It's hard to put into words how uncomfortable I felt about the concept of fighting naked. I kept thinking to myself that I should try to put my pants on quickly, but I couldn't bring myself to do it, because if the door opened while my pants were at my ankles, I would be completely destroyed. I also thought about the consequences of fighting someone miles away from the next person. I mean, what are the stakes, right? I've been in more than a few bar fights, and even enjoyed boxing with friends, but there was never any real danger. If someone is hurt, everyone breaks. Will this guy stop fighting if he wins? Is it to death, in my opinion? I'm so scared I'm almost panicking now, but I'm trying to control my breathing and give myself the best chance to get out of this. After he spends what seems like forever trying to get in, though it's probably a minute or two, he stops screaming and banging and I call him. Hey man, I'm so sorry, I'll give you another quarter, okay? There is no answer. I wait a few more minutes and finally relax a little. He must have come to his senses. I restart my shower, thinking about how amazing it is and wondering if he'll be waiting for me. But then I remembered my truck. I have several thousand worth of tools. I literally cannot afford to lose them, and I'm sure he's into it now. So, soaking wet, I jump out of the shower, throw on my pants, slam the cubicle door open, and run out to my car. Turning the corner of the building in the direction of the parking lot at full speed, man, I was so relieved to see that he was nowhere to be found. That means he must have snuck off to where he was hiding out there in the desert. I currently work at a restaurant somewhere in the Midwest. Obviously, I can't tell which restaurant it is, but it's on a pretty busy road with lots of cars and lots of people walking along the road to get to the bus stop or to their destination. It has its own parking lot where I usually park closer to the door, but the story I'm about to tell is the only time I didn't. I sincerely regret my actions that night. So to give you some background, a couple of years ago, I was just working at a sports bar and grill right across the parking lot from my current job. I only worked there for 4 months, and I have many interesting stories about the place, but that's for another time. Anyway, while I was at my previous job, I didn't have a car, so I either walked to and from work or got a ride. Mind you, sometimes I walked home around 10 p.m. on a dimly lit road when there weren't always cars around. This naturally made me wary, and this was in addition to the fact that older men kept attacking me as a minor and making me feel like I was being watched. And this backstory to my old job might not seem that important at the moment, and I didn't think it would ever be relevant again. But it does matter in the end, I promise. At my old job, I was underage, as stated before, but that never stopped drunken men from coming up to me and behaving inappropriately. There was one person in particular who I never forgot, and who came back to haunt me in the worst possible way. The man was taller, quite handsome, and always wore expensive clothes and accessories. He was in a very elegant mood, so I didn't think much of him when he talked to me while I was working. He began very politely, asking how work was going, how my day was, and so on. But as the weeks went by, he asked more and more personal questions, which made me suspicious of him. But the event that happened right before I quit was a night I'd like to forget when I look back on my days at that sports bar. I remember it being a long night, maybe because it was sports season and our restaurant was very busy at that time. And as a housewife, it was really hard for me to take calls when they were yelling because the hockey team is the Gold Cup or something. That night when I finished cleaning the bathrooms, I remember he was at the hostess counter waiting for me. I approached him and tried to make a polite conversation, but immediately noticed that he was behaving strangely. His gaze wavered, and he didn't look as composed as usual. The first thing he said to me was something like, "You're only 16, right?" To which I confirmed. And he continued something like, "When you turn 18, I'll have something for you. It'll be a surprise. Wait till you turn 18. And he instantly left the bar part of the group. I stood there in shock for a moment before gathering myself and finishing cleaning up to just get out of there. After I finished calculating my drawdown, I went back out and unlocked the bike I got a month or so after I started working there and started riding home. Note that I was paranoid when I did this because seriously, who says something like that to an underage girl? I watched my back all night as I drove home and felt like I was being watched the whole time. It was my fault that he knew my age. I told him this a long time ago when I think I mentioned something about birthday plans, but his comment about my age just made me sick to my stomach. Now let's fast forward to recently, when I started my new job across the parking lot. It's been years since I worked there, and I've almost lost my memories of working in a horrible place. But something happened recently that made the memories feel like yesterday. You see, stimulus checks and good weather have led to an increase in customers to my current restaurant. I've been here for almost a year now, and we've been busier this past month than we've been since I first started. This means that every now and then I don't get to park at the door and have to park a little further away. To this day, I still get nervous thinking about I had to park in the far corner of the lot due to the large number of staff and customers occupying nearby spaces. I didn't think anything of it that day as I went on my last shift and worked a long and stressful shift until about 10 p.m. I work at the front of the restaurant, and our closing duties can be quite grueling, so that night was particularly bad as I was the only one up front apart from the manager who had to go back and forth between the kitchen and front desk to help. So I finished all my cleaning, albeit a little later than usual, and felt bad that it took so long. But they weren't too upset because my colleague was waiting for a ride, so they had to wait anyway. With that, I say goodbye to them and head out the back door to my car. I was immediately annoyed that I had to walk so far to get to my car, and I started looking for my keys. And somewhere in all of this, I didn't realize there was a third car in our parking lot until it was actually too late. I finally grabbed my keys after trying to find them for a moment and realized the third car wasn't actually my manager, and it was also parked next to mine, although it looked similar, so I didn't think much of it. He was exhausted at first work and all. As I got closer, I realized that there was a person inside, so I remember thinking, has my colleague come here or something? But no one came out to go home, so I assumed not. I looked closer to the restaurant and realized that at the front of the building, which I had not been able to see before because I had left it behind, my manager's car was parked empty right in front. All these thoughts were starting to come together as I slowly walked to my car and, connecting the dots, I tried to see who was waiting for me in the car. I remember squinting at them. I didn't have my glasses on, and that probably made them realize that I actually noticed them. And with that, they started the car. I immediately looked away because the light in the car was too bright, and when I tried to look back, the interior light was on. I stopped in place as if paralyzed. Even sharing this makes me feel terrible, but the look on this man's face was so frightening that I think my heart literally skipped a beat. A little blurry because of the distance and darkness, but I could tell he knew me from somewhere by the little light that illuminated his face. But basically, it was the lack of facial expression that scared me, because I thought he was going to smile, or frown, or wave or something. But instead, he sat with his hands at his sides and waited for me to come closer. Now, as a young woman, I know better than to ignore my instincts telling me to get out of this situation. But for a split second, I almost felt compelled to continue to my car. I can't explain why, but I distinctly remember taking one step forward before pause, asking myself, what am I doing? And then he went back to the back door. I felt like prey about to be eaten, the way I felt this overwhelming presence behind me. The whole time I was thinking about turning back and then running to safety, but he just sat right where he was and didn't seem to move an inch. At least that's what I'm assuming, because I didn't look around too much until I got to the door. I glanced at his car for a split second before rushing inside, and all I remember was seeing the lights in his cabin go off, and now all I could see was a dark figure, the menacing light no longer illuminating his face. I didn't need to see his face to know he was still looking, and I could just feel his beady eyes looking right at me. Well, scaring my coworkers by yanking on the back door like I did, I explained what happened. They both immediately became serious and told me to wait with them while they waited for my other colleague's ride. We sat for a few minutes, and they talked about how horrible the situation was and how they were going to call the police if he was still around when we went outside together. But I just sat there in silence. I kept quiet because within minutes of meeting this strange man, I knew I recognized him from somewhere. In fact, I knew it was the same guy who told me to wait for him when I turned 18. It took me a while because he didn't look like he used to. He looked a lot more worn out, a little older, and much, much scarier. I don't know if he saw me that day when I was taking out the trash, or maybe when I went to work or something, but he knew I was there somehow, and the thought scared me. When their car finally arrived, we all got out together, and I immediately cast my eyes to where I knew his car was parked. But now it was just my car waiting for me to get inside and get home as fast as possible. The manager escorted my colleague to their parents' car and escorted me to mine. She helped me check under my car and inside, as apparently she had dealt with a stalker before and knew all the tricks to stay safe. And I thanked her profusely and got in and immediately locked the door. I watched her as she walked to her car and started to pull out of the parking lot. I searched frantically to see if I could spot his car anywhere in the shopping area that connected to our parking lots, but in the end, I couldn't find anything. I live near my work, so I had a long drive home that night, afraid he was waiting for me to go home and do something sinister. Needless to say, I didn't sleep well that night, as I kept thinking he was in the darkest corner of my room with that blank expression on his face. I thought about filing a police report, but seeing as how the police are usually pretty useless in these situations, and I literally only had a name that might as well have been fake, I decided against it. I haven't seen or heard from him in weeks since then. I still think of him every time I leave the building, half expecting him to either be standing outside ready to grab me or parked next to my car. Now I always leave with my coworkers, even though my parents insisted I start doing so after I tell them what happened. To this day, I still wonder why he remembered that I was 18, almost 19 now. But he didn't know exactly when my birthday was, of course not, although he came around when I was 18, but I almost completely forgot about it. I hope I never find out what surprise he had in store for me, that's for sure. And all in all, I definitely think I've earned the right to say I never want to see this guy again. It happened a few years ago when I was about 13 years old. I'm 5'7" and about 125 pounds, so I'm pretty small, but I usually carry pepper spray and a pocket knife. But I'm embarrassed to say that in the excitement of exploring with my best friends, I forgot my pepper spray and knife today. Although I love to explore and even travel, especially to places I'm not allowed to go. So when I moved, one of the first places I explored was the railroad tracks. One day, my best friend came over to explore the area with me, and we decided that the railroad tracks were the perfect place to start. We walked for an hour or two, but it was still light outside, and we had just passed a small street, so we felt safe. But as I turned to drop my stick, I saw 5 hooded figures suddenly following us from about 200 feet away. I tried to pretend I didn't see them, and calmly told my best friend what I saw. We decided to look at them directly and see what they would do. But as soon as we looked at them, they stopped. And my friend and I too. We looked at each other for a few seconds. Finally, they made their move, and 3 of them went left and 2 went right. We heard loud and fast footsteps, so we finally broke out of our trance and ran as fast as we could. Luckily, we were both on cross-country teams, and the adrenaline that kept us together kept us running faster than ever before. Fortunately, because I had explored some of these trails alone a few days earlier, I knew that if we walked another half-mile, we would be on a bridge over another small area. We somehow managed that too. Had no idea if we were being watched or not, but out of fear, we jumped 10 feet down and kept running deep into the neighborhood until we finally saw other people. And then we slowly walked home, shivering and exhausted. Looking back on it all now, I really regret not telling my parents, but I was afraid they wouldn't let me go out and explore alone anymore. I didn't walk those paths again, and I won't, but still, I probably should have told someone because who knows, maybe someone else will be down there and maybe they won't be as fast. When I say my grandfather was a real badass, I really mean it. He was born in Alberta in the early 1930s and raised his 3 brothers on a reservation from the time he was about 9 when his parents left for British America with their only daughter, promising to return, and none of the boys did not see them. To make ends meet, he learned carpentry and worked as a handyman, occasionally boxing against older men for extra cash. He learned to track and hunt, and always came home with something to eat when there was little to do. When he was 14 years old, he entrusted the farm to his second oldest brother, left the town in search of his parents and a better life, and simply did not return. And that was the last time he saw any of his family members. However, he spent several months riding the rails, befriending some transients while using his fighting skills to protect himself from others. He eventually made it to Vancouver, the last known location of his parents and sister, and began working in a pulp mill. As far as I've heard too, nothing bad or weird happened until my mom found an old Ouija board and played with it herself. But I don't know if that has anything to do with this story or something, but it's always mentioned. But my mother was about 8 years old when she was riding her horse through the wooded part of their grounds, and the horse just stopped in place. Well, Mom tried to push him, but he seemed to freeze in fear, and suddenly she smelled like rotten garbage and meat. She pulled on the reins, and the horse instantly turned and galloped backwards toward the house, almost knocking her off his back several times. This horse was never the same afterwards either. He tried to kick her, and when she got on top of him, he fell back trying to crush her under him. One day he started behaving like before, letting her climb on top of him, but as soon as she did, he just ran towards the road and stopped abruptly, knocking her forward into the path of an oncoming car. My grandpa actually saw it happen, and even put a gun to his head while the horse continued to pant and stare straight ahead. My mother almost got hit by a car that day who saw the horse coming and managed to swerve one last time, and my grandmother begged my grandfather not to shoot the horse. But he finally decided to give it up when he saw that my mother is not badly injured. That same horse fell on the next rider, breaking his collarbone, and Father did what my grandfather said he should have done the first time. But after that, the animals began to go missing, and one of the hunting dogs was wounded in some way during the night attack. My grandpa set some traps and stayed in the hay above the barn with a shotgun and a rifle by his side and slept there for several nights at a time. He figured they were foxes, or maybe coyotes, or wolves, or even a desperate bear, and that's what he attributed to the smell in the woods and the reason the horse lost his mind. But nothing happened the whole night he slept there, and in the end he just decided it had moved on to easier prey, or maybe even died. The day after he stopped sleeping in the barn, my mom was near the tree line playing with the injured dog while it was healing, when out of nowhere the dog started sniffing the air and then stood between my mom and the trees, growling and barking. My grandfather heard the commotion and came out, stopped in his tracks, and called to my grandmother to fetch his rifle, and then whistled to the dogs. My grandmother came out and handed him the gun and asked what was going on. When all the dogs started to react like the first one, my grandpa pointed to one of the treetops that looked longer and thicker than the ones. In his delirium, he called it an alien, but said it was coming back for him. In my entire life, I had never seen this man scared of almost anything, but this time there was real panic and fear in his voice. A few nights before he died, he was already too weak to stand on his own for a few days, and my grandmother was awakened by a shot. She ran outside, fearing the worst, and saw her grandfather lower his rifle and stare at something in the distance. She took the gun and helped him back inside, and that was it. I don't know if it all actually came back to him, or if it was just a hallucination of an old memory or something, but I'd like to think that he's finally gotten the hang of what his family tried to torture him with all those years ago. To set the scene, I live in a small town in Florida very close to the coast. It's a bit of a suburban town, and it's usually pretty quiet at night. But since the shutdown, people are so eager to go home and just go to bed to get to work in the morning. But I work in the service and still work just as much, if not more, before all that. I see a lot more people at night partying or driving at odd hours, just walking around the city and whatnot. One night my dad picked me up from his last shift, but we decided to go around the corner because it was faster. It's still fairly populated with houses, a church, and a high school down the road, but it's poorly lit. And to be honest, it was actually a pretty lame ride. We just talked as usual, catching up on how our day was and whatnot, until we made the final turn onto a stretch of road next to a church. And in the middle of the road was what I can only describe as a creature. Physically, he was huge and covered in thick, dark fur. For size reference, my dad drives a 2005 Dodge Ram, and the headlights just reached his shoulders. But he had 6 really skinny legs, and he was kind of hunched over and dragging one of them behind him. And they kind of curved outwards, which made me wonder if they had to, or if they were heavily bent or something. I really can't logically think of any animal it could have been, to be honest, unless it was mutated or born deformed or something, but the sounds it made were unlike anything I've ever heard. When our headlights hit him, he seemed to drop to the ground, scream, and then just run away into the woods, but the screams were shrill and very wet, as if they were licking his throat. I saw him stumble off the road and hit a tree before screaming again, and then just disappearing. My dad stopped the truck and we got out with a flashlight. We only stayed for a few minutes as we were both very shaken but looked for blood or marks, but there was none. What I do remember is that the entire stretch of road in front of our truck was covered with what looked like white sand, and even though we were close to the beach, it was almost entirely forested. After that, though, we got back in the truck and just drove home. My dad just refuses to talk about it, and we don't really go down that road anymore after that. I guess the reason I'm sharing this here is because I'd like to know if any of you guys know what the heck it was. So, one evening my wife, son, and I went to my wife's parents' house for the night. It was getting dark, and my son, who was about 2 years old at the time, had really fallen asleep, so I decided to put him to bed. Let me also try to explain the room to you because it is very relevant for later. So the door opens on the right side of the room. Immediately to your left is the light switch, and next to it is a queen-size bed. It's a fairly small room, just big enough for a bed and enough space to walk around the bed. There is a window in the wall in front of the bed, and to the left of the bed is a wardrobe with these amazing accordion doors. So I'm lying in bed with the lights off with my son resting his head on my arm. He finally falls asleep, and I just lie there for a few minutes to make sure he's completely out. When out of nowhere I just get this horrible feeling. Goosebumps, hair standing on end on neck and arms. It was just such an evil feeling. Do you ever get goosebumps on your scalp where you feel like your scalp is shrinking? Well, I did that night. So bad, in fact, that it literally felt like someone put a hand on my head and squeezed it. I was honestly afraid, not so much for myself, but for my son. And somehow I just knew deep down that if I turned my back on my son, something bad would happen to him. I thought if I could turn on the light, I could grab my son and leave the room, so where I was in bed, I could barely touch the plastic frame on the switch. I was afraid to move because I knew that if I did, whatever it would get my son. However, his head was on my hand the whole time, so I finally took the risk. I pulled my hand out from under my son and quickly turned on the light. To be honest, it only took a split second, but when I turned to grab it, now he was at the bottom of the mattress, as if something had pulled him from the top down in a split second. And I know he didn't crawl in there because, well, he was still fast asleep and just couldn't move that fast. So I grabbed him and we left that room and just slept in the living room that night. Something evil wanted my baby, and it really terrifies me. It was a few months ago and the quarantine was already in place, so I spent a lot more time in and around the house than usual. There is a park very close to my house, so one day I decided to go for a short run just to get out and get some fresh air. I ran from home to the park, and since I'm not in the best shape, I decided to take a short break. I noticed the guy looking in my direction but didn't think much of it until I started jogging again and he started walking at the same time. Since I was jogging, I eventually lost it, so I thought that was it. But man, I was wrong. A few hours have passed and I'm asleep when I noticed through the window the lights of a car flashing back and forth on my street. The window of my room overlooks my street. Now I know some people might think this is okay, but I live in a very quiet area, so I wanted to see what was going on. And as I thought, a car was going back and forth on my street. Then the car pulls up right in front of my house, and the same guy gets out of the passenger seat, which means there's at least one other person with him. I was still half awake by this point, but the sight of the same guy looking out my window, seeing me and smiling, woke me up very quickly. I immediately close the blinds, which are a little transparent by the way, and climb into bed, phone in hand. After waiting for a while and thinking I was being stupid, I went back to sleep only to be woken up by a light knocking on the window. Remember when I said my blinds are pretty much transparent? Well, I could make out a silhouette of a man, probably the same guy, because the car lights were still on outside, and he was now squatting by my window, knocking on the outside. The first thing that came to my mind was to not move and try to pretend I was still asleep, not knowing if he could actually see my room or not. And then I remember that my room is on the second floor. So how the hell did he get on the little roof outside my window? I had no idea, but I knew it wasn't going to be easy going down. I slowly pull the blanket over my head and call the police, whispering that the guy is still knocking. They told me to slowly back away from the window in case he broke in or something, and that they would be there in about 5 minutes. I crawled out of bed into the bathroom where I could see the street behind my house and waited. After a couple of minutes, I heard the knocking stop. Then silence. Then a loud thump. Then silence again and a knock at my door downstairs. I was still talking to the operator when I heard someone calling that it was the police and that the guy was gone. I told the operator that the police had thankfully arrived, and she told me to wait. There was silence, and she said that the police had not yet arrived and that they would not open the door under any circumstances. Soon she tells me that the police are here and that I can go and open the door. I go and check outside my bedroom window just out of paranoia, and there were actually 3 police cars and about 5 or 6 officers outside my house. I go downstairs when one of them knocks. I open the door, thank the operator, and hang up. I tell them everything, and they tell me that the guy was gone when they arrived, but there was no one there. In the following days, I saw officers on my street, but I did not receive any news from the boys. Apparently, the only thing they found was a rope and a small knife, No fingerprints, no car, no boyfriend, nothing.